hot skills, it's a bit of a cliche and hard sometimes to explain to everybody in detail, but for every job, in every sector, in every country, in every market, there are an evolving set of hot skills that you need to have to perform your job and that employers look for in their ideal candidate, whatever that ideal is. If you know those hot skills that are in demand and that are being sought, again, it makes life a lot easier. Now, we tend to know what those are across a variety of sectors. If you don't know what they are, it's something you need to seek out and find. Sometimes there are clues in the job advertisements. The employer has them on their websites. It's really important this day and age to know what those skills are being sought, what people are looking out for. And rather crudely and maybe aggressively, we exist to write CVs that smash down doors. So we've got a whole bunch of clients out there, people that use us to write their CVs, so we know whether we're getting results in the marketplace. So what I'm going to tell you about this evening is some of that evidence and proof. So it does know it work. It's not just theory. We actually put this into practice day in, day out. So that's enough about us. What is a CV? It's a good place to start, seeing as that's what we're talking about. And there are some really interesting things and some hints and tips that I would give you, because there are some bad practices which most people unfortunately seem to still adopt on their CV, and some things therefore to address quickly if you follow the same pattern. So historically, I think most people will have created a CV at some time in their lives, possibly still now, which is essentially just a list of things. So jobs, qualifications, contact details, duties, responsibilities, blah, 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 blah. And you might think, well, big deal, that's what a CV is, surely. Well, for those that have ever had to face the task of filling out an employer's application form, you might then get some clues as to why just providing a list of things on your CV is not such a good idea. So if you've ever applied, particularly in the public sector, NHS, armed forces, other forces, or some big employers in the private sector, they're forcing folk to fill out application forms these days rather than just submit a CV. And in some cases, they won't even accept your CV, interestingly. They'll just accept application forms. And you may have struggled with some of the content on those forms, which have asked things like, please give us in less than 250 words or in less than 1,000 words or 2,000 characters an example of when you did something or other, or the last time you experienced such and such a thing. Now, you probably thought, okay, this is really tough. Where do I get this information from? And that's exactly why the employers are asking for it. They're forcing you to have to provide the evidence to back up the claims and competences that either you're claiming to have or that they're seeking in an ideal candidate. So if you've ever completed one of those forms and really sweated thinking, how do I fill it in, that is a good sign that your CV is probably not where it should be, because those employers are collecting information that they will make a decision on. If your CV doesn't already have that kind of information on it, it's probably not going to work very well in the marketplace. Another bad indicator is if you're using essentially a CV that you've had and evolved over time since leaving education, be that school, college or university. If you then started with a CV and all you've done really is add to it over time, that's a bad indicator for reasons that will become apparent shortly. So our argument, and probably the single most important message I'd encourage you to take away this evening, is that your CV, however you construct it, should present a business case, a strong business case as to why somebody should hire you. And that is not just a list of things. That's really important. And the business case has to be with a considerable amount of thought given to who your target or what your target audience is. And that may vary from job to job if you've got multiple skills. So, as I say, big message to take away. A bad CV is just a list of things. So if you've just got effectively a whole list of personal details on your CV, followed by education, followed by jobs, with job titles, duties, responsibilities, hobbies, interests, things like that. If they're just a list of things and they don't really add any value or explain what you've got to offer the world, chances are your CV is not going to perform too well in the marketplace. And whenever I refer to the sort of not performing or not being successful, I do mean the document. I don't mean individuals. Most employers, most recruiters, and certainly me at this moment in time have no idea what you or any of your peer group are like as individuals. All we can do is judge you on the contents of the CV. So if you're presenting a strong business case to your target audience, you do pretty well. If you're not, you won't. Nothing to do with your capability, everything to do with what people are perceiving you to be capable of because of what you've sent them via your CV or other similar means. Another interesting development over recent years, so particularly if you've evolved a CV over time and your career is anything more than 10 years long, many of you will be well aware that things like the internet and Google and job board databases and LinkedIn, not many of them existed 10 years ago, and they certainly didn't exist in the form they currently are now. So if your CV hasn't evolved to match the technology, again, you're probably at a disadvantage. People are using keywords, so much as you search for information via any search engine, probably Google, but whoever you use, you're used to operating that way, finding information based on a word, a phrase, whatever. That's how people find your CV these days. That's how people unearth whether you're the right kind of candidate. Some people are good at those search criteria, some people aren't very good. Some people understand how to use the software at their disposal, some don't. And your CV has to navigate those hurdles to do its job. So that's another important area. We'll touch on that later. Finally, given that most people probably now would be thinking, yeah, I think I might be part way there, or there's some things that I'm definitely doing and they're obviously bad things, and I don't think I'm presenting a business case. The absolute acid test for your CV, whatever I tell you, whatever anybody else tells you for that matter, is its ability to get you interviews. Not jobs, interviews. So hypothetically, this is assuming, of course, that you're applying for jobs you have or would believe to have a reasonable chance of performing. So if you're a checkout operator and you want to become a nuclear submarine captain, we're not going to be able to help dramatically in that unless you undergo some significant retraining. So we're talking about realism here and being realistic. So let's say you're a project manager and you're going for a senior project manager or a project management office or a program manager type of role. That makes sense. That's a logical move. It could be a move alongside. It can be an elevated promotional kind of move. Doesn't really matter. But as long as there's some relevance to it, let's say you apply for 10 jobs of that ilk. If you're not getting any interviews for those 10 jobs, it probably indicates that your CV is not doing its job. Unless the recruiter or employer knows you already, the only means they've got to make that decision is what you've sent them, either via an application form or a CV. So if you're not getting those interviews, it's the CV or the communicated message that's the problem, virtually nothing else. If the recruiter or employer does know you, that's even more worrying because, of course, they're making that judgment based on some actual fact, which is another issue and needs resolving out with this conversation. So measure the stats. If you know them already and you've got a low interview to application ratio, it's starting to tell you the CV is probably the problem. Whatever anybody might tell you, look at the hard stats. Conversely, of course, if you're getting 8, 9, 10 interviews out of the 10 applications, then to be honest, you probably don't need to do anything with your CV. It's doing its job. And there are a few cases, they are very few I have to say, but there are a few occasions where I've seen a truly, what I would call a hideous CV, but for some strange reason the person seems to be getting interviews to at least a satisfactory level. And our honest answer there is that fine, if that's happening and you're happy with the results, stick with it. Something's working. So what I tell people to be wary of is that if you're in the marketplace, you're looking for jobs and you're not getting the interviews, if people are giving you some kind of strange explanation for why that is, which isn't, oh, I'm afraid it's your CV, it's just not strong enough, but they're telling you, oh, there are better people in the marketplace, there's better people qualified, yeah, fine. If you've got to interview and somebody's making that decision after they've seen you face-to-face, that is a different issue. That's something to do with how you are face-to-face with people, the messages you're giving off, or some other detailed, bigger issue. But if you're not getting the interviews to have those discussions, it's got nothing to do with the state of the marketplace, or very little to do with it. It's got nothing to do with your abilities to perform the role or what somebody might think about that, other than they're looking at the CV and coming away with a negative perception. So if you don't have the stats and you fear that your CV may not perform in the marketplace, it's difficult, isn't it? Do you change something or seek advice before sending out into the marketplace, or do you just face applying, measuring the stats and realizing you might actually lose a few opportunities before you've got the statistics to measure the performance of your CV? And ultimately, that's your call. But for those that are interested, if you ever feel that you want your CV independently assessed, we'll do that for free. Go to our website. There's a box you can click. Send us your CV. We'll give you an honest assessment. It will be a crude assessment, of course, because we don't know everything, but it will be a quick and dirty. Do we think this will work in the marketplace or not, on a scale of 1 to 10? But the acid test is, if you get your CV into the marketplace, it's not performing, do something about it, and then at least you know you've got the evidence to say, right, what can I do, and do I need to do anything? For those that might be thinking, okay, well, I think I'm already gone through that pain, my CV is not working, what do I do? Well, of course, this evening is about things you can do, but if you get anybody else to write your CV, be that us or anybody else for that matter who knows what they're doing, does it make a difference? Well, the proof suggests that it does, and typically, as you see at the bottom of this slide, the kind of increment we see in people who are actually getting results and interviews from a better, improved CV is quite dramatic. You know, a substantial double-digit increase, typically 30 to 50% more interviews than they were previously getting. So a good CV, and I do stress, you know, obviously we do write them, but if you put together a more compelling business case as to why somebody should hire you, it will make a tremendous difference. Okay, let's take a look at how we should structure the CV and some of the things that we'd recommend you do. So this is the practical, do this and it'll make a difference kind of section. So a lot of people tend to open up their CV with what they call a profile, a personal profile, an introduction, a summary, an objective. Sometimes we use a bit of an odd terminology because most people then don't write an objective underneath it, just list the whole thing, the whole list of things they're good at. Doesn't really matter what you call it within reason. We tend to call that opening statement a professional or an executive summary. And we do believe they're important, but the content is absolutely critical. And most people get this hideously wrong for reasons I'll come on to. But this opening statement, now and I will show you a real life example shortly when I've gone through a couple of sections just to show you how it all fits together. But typically, the top of the CV would be your name. And there'd be a bit of contact information, but not very much. Again, I'll come on to that later. And then this paragraph, which is a summary about what you've got to offer the world. And the most important thing about that is it's actually got to describe what you are. So if you're a project manager, you say words to the effect, I am a project manager, or I'm an experienced project manager, or I'm a Prince 2 qualified project manager. But you state pretty much what you are, be that generically or precisely, and that should be aligned to what your target audience is actually looking for. So if, a stupid example coming up now, but if you were, for example, that supermarket checkout operator and you were going for a nuclear submarine captain role, you wouldn't put checkout supermarket operator, because as soon as anybody read that, your CV would be in the bin. Okay, you'd need to find a more subtle way of getting about what skills you've got to offer. You still probably wouldn't get very far, I hasten to add, but it was a stupid example, an extreme. Broadly, though, if you're going for jobs with a particular title, be that generic or specific, you need to be pretty clear about the fact that you're almost what that audience is looking for. And if you deviate from that too far, you will probably lose people's interest at that very moment in time. Or if you're vague about what you are, people probably won't read much further. So state what you are, very simple. The second bit, a bit of a cliche I'm afraid again, but what is your value proposition? In other words, what is the reason that you exist in this job? What are you able to deliver and offer? What's the return on the investment that the employer is going to get for sinking a few tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds in you every year? You've got to hint at that pretty quickly. Most people don't, so by doing this, you're automatically differentiating yourself in a positive way from most of your competition. That links to things that you're particularly good at, and that's probably 3, 4, 5 things, probably no more than that. Again, areas where you've got a track record in delivering results. I'll show you an example shortly when this is all put together. And I said I'd mention hot skills a few times this evening. You've got to align the what are you to some degree, but certainly the value proposition and what you're good at with the hot skills in the marketplace. So again, a bit of an exaggeration and an extreme. But if you're in IT and you went on and on and on about your skills at delivering systems based on DOS, Windows 3.1, Windows 95, or anything like that, or messing around with, I don't know, tape drives, or any kind of hardware or software that was obviously dated, you're not helping your case in today's modern world. So they're not hot skills. People who know Windows 95, for those of you that actually even remember it, that's not a hot skill. So however important it might have been at the time that you were involved in that, it's just not worth mentioning it because your CV will get thrown out straight away. Here's an example of a good, strong professional summary. Now, I stress, you can read this at your leisure. I'm not going to read it verbatim. I'll pick out some key bits in a minute. A few things to note. First of all, it addresses all the things I've just talked about. So if we look at this statement, what are they? What was this person? An experienced finance director. What's their value proposition? They've got an ability to protect cash flow and profitability. Pretty important in a business. Of course, they're a finance director. You probably expect it, but that's what they exist to do. What are they particularly good at? The bulk of the middle part of that paragraph. And we have to assume that they are aligning those skills with what's relevant in the marketplace. We don't know because we don't know what the job is, and we don't know this specific individual beyond what's given to you in this paragraph. Anybody at any level, in any sector, in any stage of their life, or at any stage of their life, could write something like this. So it doesn't have to be, doesn't mean that you're a senior person. If you're a junior person, if you just graduated, if you've just left college, everybody can write something that is well focused to their target audience. It just needs a little bit of thought. Now you'll notice what this isn't and what this doesn't contain is any of the nonsense that most people put on their CV at this stage, which is how enthusiastic they are, how dedicated they are, how committed they are, how wonderful they are at being a team player or working in isolation. So there's a horrible phrase that a lot of people use, which is can work as an individual or as part of a team. Hideous nonsense, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend, but it just is wholly pointless. The reason why these things are pointless is because although they're valuable skills, none of them can be proven on the CV, and more particularly, none of them really will come out of the woodwork until you've worked with a business for 2, 3, 4, 5 months. Way beyond the interview stage. So the job of the CV is to get you the interview. You're not trying to paint a picture about what it would be like once you've actually sat in the job for a while and all the things that are intangible. What you're trying to do is prove at a particular moment in time that you're worth interviewing because of the capabilities and competencies that you have and no more. So you can jettison a lot of stuff that's irrelevant, and the relevant stuff includes talking about things that can't be proven on the CV. So that's enthusiasm, dedication, commitment, passion, interpersonal skills, communication skills, and the ability to work as part of a team or in isolation. That's all irrelevant, and people skim straight over it, go yada, 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 here we go again, where's the hard-hitting factual stuff? So if you write a paragraph like the one on the screen at the moment, you'll do a lot better. It's a lot more focused. So that's the opening statement. Now, as I said right up front, there's been a few people joined the session since then. If you've got any questions, as I say, because it's an audio one-way broadcast, you can only hear me. Type them into the GoToWebinar question facility, chat room facility, whatever it is on your toolbar, and I'll come round to them at the end of the session. So we started off the CV, got an opening statement about what we are, what's our value proposition, what are we good at. I hinted at earlier that one of the things that you should be on your CV, and you should restructure your CV to cater for, are the requirements to work digitally these days. So we build into our CVs that we're writing for our clients, and I'd recommend that you do this, a section, if you don't already have it, which is populated, or an area where you can populate part of the CV with keywords and phrases that we know are either hot in the marketplace or being searched for by recruiters and employers on a regular basis for your kind of job, so that as soon as your CV enters the digital world, which is pretty much as soon as you've sent it anywhere these days, So that be that on LinkedIn, if it's there, a job board database, a recruiter's own database, an employer's own database. Most employers these days have got some form of applicant tracking system, candidate database, or access to these things. You need to make sure your document's picked up electronically as much as it would be for an application. So SEO on this slide, by the way, is search engine optimization. So a bit like getting a website appear high on Google rankings, you want your CV to appear high on the list of a recruiter's search or an employer's search. Part of the way you can do that is to introduce phrases and statements like those that are appearing on your screen right now on the CV. And I'll show you again, very shortly, I'll show you a real-life example where this all sort of sticks together. But typically, we create an area on the CV just underneath the professional summary that reinforces key things that we know the marketplace are looking for, but of course that you have to have some kind of competence within. You can't just put any old stuff here. It's got to be something you could justify and back up. Again, notice none of these things are to do with enthusiasm, dedication, or any other behavioural traits. They're all factual, business-related, commercial, practical, things that could be proven on the CV at some later stage, and certainly, if asked for an interview, could be proven. They tend to be 2, 3, 4-word top statements, and typically a CV would have 5 to 7 down the left-hand side, 5 to 7 down the right-hand side, so a nice balanced table. But if you're really clever about this, it makes your CV appear much higher up people's search engines, databases, etc., etc. It also visually, I have to say, makes the, as you'll see shortly, makes the CV much more aesthetically pleasing because it's highlighting things. If you're clever again about this, if you've got a job spec or an advertisement which says we're looking for these skills, forget about trying to say, if a lot of adverts in fairness say we want people who've got good communication, good interpersonal skills, it's not good enough to then reflect that on your CV because they'll be proven another part of the process. So when an employer sets out their ideal candidate and the skills required, they've got like a matrix, or most employers will have a matrix and say, okay, these are certain skills that we'll assess at interview, these are certain skills we'll assess by the CV, these are certain skills we'll assess through some practical assessment, maybe second interview, psychometric tests, etc., etc. So don't try and imagine or convey on your CV everything that the employer is wanting at that moment in time. Try and be clever about it. Think, okay, what are these guys really after? What's going to help get me the interview? And it's the functional, provable skills that will get you the interview, not reaffirming soft stuff, behavioural stuff like communication skills, because you can't prove it on a CV. You can only prove that face-to-face. You've got to get the interview first to be able to prove that face-to-face. Okay, comment at the bottom of this slide is really important, but it seems very obvious at first glance. I've sort of hinted at this already. The vast majority of recruiters and hiring managers can only make their decisions on who to interview based on the content of your CV. And you might think, well, of course, how else are they going to do it? But that's the message. They haven't got a crystal ball. Unless they know you, and for the mathematicians amongst you, the difference between 100% of the recruiters and hiring managers and the 92% on the slide, i.e. the 8%, that's a variety of things. And it could be that the recruiter already knows you, so they don't need to see your CV. It could be the employer already knows you because that you've seen them before or had some dealings. Or it could be they've picked up on you through some other means, possibly LinkedIn. But the vast majority, the only means they've got to assess your ability is by looking at the CV. So if your CV is a hideous mess and failing to convey all the good things that you are, you won't get interviews. And it doesn't matter how good a candidate you are, and it doesn't matter, you could go blue in the face, yeah, but I'll prove all of these things at interview. If you're not getting the interviews, guess what? You can't prove any of these things. So focus everything on get the interview and then move on to the next stage. And get that CV aligned to make sure that it's telling your target audience what they want to see, as long as you can prove it and demonstrate it. Okay, I promised to show you a real-life example, so what I'll do is just pop onto the screen now, and it's gradually refreshing. Most of you should be able to see a CV which is Matt's CV. He actually runs our business, and it's the two sections we've just talked about. Now you'll notice just a few issues which I may touch on again later. Format-wise, people get hung up about this sort of thing. Main thing is crisp, clear, non-threatening, a font that's not going to insult anybody's intelligence or make them feel that you're taking the mickey. Just nice, clear, crisp, overall format. Quite a bit of white space around the borders, you'll notice, this being a sheet of A4 in theory. That's important because you don't want to try and get as much text onto the page as you can possibly fit. Some people think, oh, I've got to have a 2-page CV, got all this information, right, I'll stretch it to the far ends of the margin, and that's going to fit it onto 2 pages, and people will think I'm very clever. Unfortunately, they won't. What they'll think is, here's somebody who's tried to squeeze all this text into a small space. It looks too busy, it's very hard to digest and read. Plus, at a very simple level, there's nowhere for them to scribble on without obliterating your hard-earned work. So there's a few simple considerations. Give people a bit of white space. It makes it easier to read. It centralizes the text. It's easier to digest. It works, bottom line. But the two sections we've talked about, you can see how they hang together now. So we've got executive summary, which is Matt's, what is he, what's his value proposition, what's he good at, and aligning that to, again, hot skills that we'd have to imagine exist because we don't know his real circumstances. And then just under that, we've called it expertise, but it could be key skills. It doesn't really matter, or areas of expertise, but a number of bullet points of things that Matt is good at, but importantly, we know people in his space would be searching for in databases, Google, LinkedIn. So his CV is likely to get picked up more often than not during electronic digital searching through whatever means. Okay, we'll come back to that shortly, but I just wanted to show you roughly how the structure is. One thing you'll notice, quite apart from the fact that, again, Matt's not talking about anything behavioural at this stage, he's also not mentioning where he's worked currently. So for those of you who lead their CV with things like education, or you go straight into where you're employed, those are sort of no-nos because you're not building the business case. Remember, the most important thing you take away from this evening is your CV's got to build a business case as to why somebody should hire you. Okay, let's take a look at another section of the CV. Again, you might have just seen this at the top of Matt's example just then. We call it career highlights, but if we're building a business case as to why somebody should hire you, we've started off by introducing what you are, what you're good at, the value proposition. We've strengthened it with some key skills which break up the CV. Aesthetically it's pleasing, but more importantly it works well through search. Then our thoughts are that you need to prove, because most employers find it really difficult on CVs to find the evidence and proof to back up why people claiming to be good at a particular job or right for a particular job. So when we're writing CVs, we make sure we provide some hard evidence to back up the claims that somebody's made earlier on in their CV, and we call that area the career highlights section. One of the things very important about the CV in general, but particularly this area, is that it helps you if you have, as I mentioned earlier, it helps if you've got an ability to write compelling content. Now, if you know that you're not very good at that, or if you struggle at that, take that as a bit of a warning sign. Don't try and fight it. Don't try and force yourself into writing a CV which takes you, two days, 2 weeks, 2 months to write. Just accept that you're not the best person to write it and get somebody to help you. Some people just hate writing CVs, but can't think of any other way around the problem. Consequently, don't write a very good CV. Might be a great candidate, but are useless at writing a CV or conveying information on the page, so to speak. So if you're not good at this thing and you know that, seek help. We use a really useful, it's not something that we invented by any means. This is a well-proven acronym. You might already have heard of it. But we use what we call a STAR methodology to construct these career highlights. Again, I'm going to show you an example very soon. but it's a really nifty way to do two things. One of which is to take complex projects, achievements, events in your life and break them down into concise, manageable chunks to explain to somebody either on the page, which is great for your CV, of course, but also as a way of answering questions at interview. So if you've ever been in a situation where you've had to answer these wonderful competency-based questions, this is a great way, once you've practiced it a few times, to take a fairly complex happening and deliver it back in a way that's reasonably concise, meaningful and compelling. So I'm going to give you an example here. Again, this you'll see later has come off Matt's CV. It's a real-life example from earlier in his career, but he does feature it on his CV because it actually is quite an impressive achievement in its own right. Again, I'm not going to read it verbatim. You can see it for yourself. I'll just pick out the key parts. So when we wrote this, when Matt wrote it, he took an event in his life which took a fairly large chunk of time and used the STAR methodology to break it down into a meaningful paragraph. Okay, and the size that this is at is about as much as people are prepared to read and absorb and remember. You go much more beyond this and people would lose the will. So you can't write War and Peace. And you'll see the first sentence is the situation. So ERAC, which stands for Enterprise Rent-A-Car, just so you know, but ERAC, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, acquired an unprofitable competitor in the south of England that required transformation. That's the situation, that's the background. It's just enough for somebody to think, oh, okay, I understand what was going on here. That means something to me. You don't need to know the detail, it's not important, it just sets the scene. The task is the responsibility resting on Matt's shoulder at that particular time in his life. And he was an operations manager and he was given things to do to sort it out, basically. The actions are the bulk of the remaining paragraph to the last sentence. So he did a variety of things as operations manager to try and move from where he was when he started to somewhere better, hopefully later on in the process. You can read them for yourself. But it's typically 3, 4, maybe 5 things that he did in chronological order, ideally. And then the result is the last sentence, and that is that in this particular case, he succeeded in rebranding the business, achieving a certain level of profitability within a certain period of time. So in a short paragraph, modest paragraph, Matt's taken something that took him at least 6 months, very complicated, involved lots of things, but he's taken the key points, he's thought about what his target audience, or he would have thought about what his target audience was thinking of and what they might find interesting, and put that into a reasonably concise statement. And that becomes one career highlight. Now, we typically put 3 of these on a CV because for some reasons, that, and I'll show you later, that's important. It's about what people are, it's enough for variety, but not too much to bore people, send people off over the edge, so to speak. So that's a career highlight. As you can see, it requires quite a tight writing style. It's not very verbose, it's not going on and on and on. It's nice, concise, meaningful. Words of caution, though, on these career highlights, because some people do put them on their CV, but one mistake is that people tend to pick weak examples, or they start off strongly and then peter out as they desperately try to think of what they've done in their lives and pick on some of the wrong examples. If you pick an example that's actually quite weak, it actually highlights failure rather than success, which doesn't help your cause. It hopefully goes without saying that they should be relevant and targeted to your target audience. So there's no point in talking about something that you actually felt really good about and maybe enjoyed if it's not relevant to what your target audience is expecting to see. That's counterproductive, of course. So you need to think about these things. And in Matt's case, it was quite a good end result. So the key performance indicator was he got the profitability sorted and he did it within a specific time period, which he could quote. That's meaningful. Somebody could grab hold of that and think, yes, this person could actually make things happen. Yes, so if we were to employ this individual, there's a good chance they could repeat that in our business to good effect. We're interested in that. We'll put him in the maybe pile or the yes pile. That's the purpose. It's building the business case as to why somebody should hire you. So pick strong examples. That doesn't necessarily, as I say, mean the best examples to you. It's the best examples for the people who are picking up your CV, who will think, in an ideal world, we want somebody who can come and do this, that, and the other. So your CV, in an ideal world, would be saying, here am I, and I can do this, that, and the other. That's the ideal. It's another area where when people come and work with us, we earn our keep, if you like, because you'd be surprised how many people, again, you'll know this yourself, if you've tried to do this, tried to think of examples, some people actually are quite modest, that's fine. Some people think it's bragging if they talk about all these wonderful things, and that's not to be done, and you're right, it isn't. You write things in the right way. They need to be positive, but they're not sort of trumpeting how brilliant Matt was. He's not talking about himself. He's not referring to himself in the first person. He's just relaying a fact. And the fact was he was appointed to do something. He did it. The end result was positive. So we're not trying to make him look superhuman or make him feel uncomfortable. We're just reporting the facts as they happened. And some people struggle with that. And so we can help. We can talk to people, extract the information from them, probe and cajole them into giving us the right information in the nicest possible way. Most people have got something lurking there that can be used to good effect. Okay, I'm going to show you again the CV just briefly to show you how, again, that hangs together. So I'll just shrink the size a bit so you can see it. So on the screen, now I have to say my my go-to webinar is reporting that you can't see the CV on the screen, and I don't believe that because I would have thought I'd been saturated now with questions. Could maybe just one or two of you just confirm that? Thank you. Yeah, good. That's fine. Yeah, for some reason I'm getting a complete blank space saying that you can't see it, but obviously that's not true. So on the screen you should have Matt's CV again, and a little bit more now showing. Still page 1, remember, and we've talked about the first 2 sections. We've just gone over the career highlights bit. You can see there are 3 examples there on Matt's CV of things that he's done, written in the same way as I described earlier, using the STAR methodology: situation, task, actions, results. Interestingly, you'll note that all 3 examples are equally weighted in terms of size. That's deliberate. If you start fiddling around with things, and people, when we're working with them, they often say, okay, but you've missed out this bit, or there's so much more to tell, or I want to get across this point, or I want to blend 17 different projects into one space. And we understand why that might be, but you have to think about, again, target audience. Target audience just want a snapshot. They just want to see proof of something that you've done or claimed earlier on in the CV that you can deliver. They're not interested in War and Peace. And if you start sort of making one look twice as big as t'other, t'other looks less important. It's just a psychological thing. It doesn't matter whether it was or not. The average reader would look at your CV and, for example, if Matt's first career highlight was 12 lines deep, the second one was 8 lines deep, and the third one was 3 lines deep, it just looks, irrespective of the truth, it just looks wrong, and it looks as if he spent all his time thinking about the first example, and then he gave up on the third example, and actually it's not that strong in the first place, irrespective of what happened in real life. It's just one of those things. So they're deliberately weighted equally to give equal importance. The other interesting fact about having 3 career highlights is that it still means, and this is quite important, that, and I'm just scrolling now, so you can see on the screen, or we'll shortly see on the screen, the bottom of page 1 of Matt's CV. We're going to talk a little bit about career history in a moment, and that section. It is important that you get the most recent or current job you're performing on page 1 of the CV. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that some people will go straight to that. Not everybody, but some people will, and judge you on that, and then come back to the beginning of the CV. Some people will read it in the order you might expect, and some people will give up by halfway down page 1. If they like what they see, you've got their attention, and if they don't, you'll lose it. Although I've hinted this earlier before, in a lot of cases, if you're in a situation where you've applied for a job and you're up against anything more than 25 or 30 competitors, chances are you will get short shrift in terms of time spent on your CV at the initial filtering process. It's unlikely anybody's going to give you much more than 20 to 30 seconds of their time. However unfair that is, or unjust. I'm afraid it's just the way it is. Most recruiters or employers or admin teams within employers, like HR teams or outsourced people or implanted HR teams, or however and whoever's looking at your CV, if they're doing that day in, day out, rightly or wrongly, they will, in the main, give you that amount of time to start with if you're up against lots of people, because their view will be somewhere here are the 3 or 4 we want to interview. I haven't got time to go through all the details because I've got a lot of stuff on today. I'm just going to whiz through and find the 3 I want to interview. It's quite likely that good people will get missed. The right candidate may actually not get employed. Technically, the best candidate may not get employed, but that is the way it is. So your CV's got to build that business case almost instantaneously, continue it until somebody's made a decision about you. And for that reason, the content is often a lot different from that which most people set out on their CV. So you'll notice on Matt's CV, which is typical of one that we'd write for a client, we're not talking about education at this stage unless Matt had a certain level of education that was worth mentioning in the opening statement, like NDA, Prince 2 qualified, degree educated, anything like that. That might be worth putting on in the first sentence, but not in any detail, just referencing the level of intellectual ability. We're not jumping into the career history because that's not the most important thing. We'll come on to that in a bit, but we are making sure it's on page 1 of the CV down at the bottom. So for those people who are going to judge him purely on where he currently or most recently was, it does appear. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about career history because, again, it's an area where people tend to make some fairly fundamental mistakes. It is all about the structure or architecture, if you want to phrase it poshly, and how you set out the details. And a lot of people, again, just rush into this. They stick their employer, the from to date, the job title, bit about what they do, and then sort of move on. Most people get this bit right. Most people tend to start on page 1, but most people tend to start too quickly, interestingly. And as I said, starting or introducing who you currently work for too quickly is not building a business case. It's actually just giving people a list, and it's also risking the fact if you work for a company that people don't understand or appreciate or value, you risk being judged on that rather than what you've got to offer the world. So there is a right and a wrong way to start it, and roughly, it's a bit later on, it's basically get your business case built and then tell people where you've worked. That works really well for some people. If you've got gaps in your career, if you're working in a job right now which isn't indicative of your real skill set, if you've had to take, because of the recession or whatever means, a backward step or a sideways step recently, and you now want to regroup and move on, mentioning who you currently are working with and at what level is not the most appealing thing about you. And you probably know that, but you feel maybe obliged to have to do it because that's the way you've already done it, always done it rather. And that's not the case, as I've shown you. Build the business case. Talk about things that have happened in your life. Doesn't matter when they've happened. If they're relevant to your target audience, a bit like that example with Matt's Enterprise Rent-A-Car. You don't know it yet, but Matt worked for Enterprise Rent-A-Car in the late 90s, which you'll see later on his CV. But he's chosen to mention a period of time over 10 years ago in a career highlight. There's no mention of time on the career highlight. He's not forced into some kind of chronological prison. He's chosen that as a highlight because it's relevant still to him as an individual. Now, others can do that also. It helps you escape some of the time constraints you might have if you've done something really meaningful earlier on in your career, or out of step with the chronological order, and you want to bring that to the fore. This is a way of doing it. Most people do start and go backwards in their career, so they start with the most recent and go backwards. A few people don't. That's a hideous practice, particularly if you've got a career which started in the 70s or 80s. I mean, it's almost a nail in the coffin of your CV. So those things are fairly straightforward. It's useful to provide a description of who you're working for, even if you're working for a big brand. So most people, generally speaking, I guess, work for a brand or a company that's probably not hugely well known. And so it's worth explaining who on earth you are working for. So if it's Joe Blogs Limited, and you're a, I don't know, project manager, national account manager, IT manager, whatever you are, if people don't know who Joe Blogs are, give them a little bit of information, size, turnover, number of employees, locations, something for them to hang their hat on and understand the context of where you're working. I'll show you an example in a minute. I hasten to add, even if you're working for a big branded company, it's still sometimes relevant. Imagine if you're working for Rolls-Royce and you just put Rolls-Royce on your CV. It may be obvious from the nature of your job, but is that the aero engine division or is it the car division? Two separate companies, two separate parentages, two separate locations. It's good to put a summary of your role. So, you know, what are you doing, and what does it mean? The structure of the team that you're within, if it applies, just to give people a feeling for how you fit in. Importantly, and particularly importantly for anybody who's got any KPIs and or working in a job role where you know damn well you must have KPIs. So again, project manager, anybody selling anything, anybody buying anything, anybody teaching anybody, you've all got KPIs of some sort. You need to explain what they are, because at some point somebody's going to ask you or judge you on that. There should be some reference to duties and responsibilities, but in the main you need to balance them with actual achievements. So crudely, a lot of people dump their duties and responsibilities off a job description into their CV. Often it's the lazy way out. You know, I can't be bothered to describe what I'm doing. This is my job description. I'll take the text, dump it on my CV. Not good. Why? Because if you're doing a role which lots of other people do across the country and all sorts of competitors of yours, guess what? Their duties and responsibilities are probably very similar to yours. So all you're doing is starting to appear like everybody else in the marketplace at that level. So you need to differentiate yourself, and the best way of differentiating yourself is, and building this business case, remember, continuing to build the business case, is to show what you've done with those duties and responsibilities, so your achievements. You don't have to go again overboard with it, but there needs to be more of them and how you can make a difference than there is just listing what you are expected to do. Sometimes, and I stress sometimes, it's appropriate to mention why you left a particular business. Generally speaking, we don't do this on CVs, but there are some reasons why you might want to. For example, headhunted by a previous boss or somebody that knew you, that's positive. Promoted, either internally or through to a sister company or subsidiary, that's positive. Selected for some particular skill, rare, but again, a positive reason. You want to be very careful about made redundant. Some people say, oh, I was made redundant. They forget they've also been made redundant several times before. Now, that might be nothing to do with the individual. It might have been quite a traumatic experience. Trouble is, the average reader, if they get this far in your CV, will be thinking, here's a track record, and it's not a positive track record, it's a negative track record, and you don't want people thinking negative things. So be very careful about reasons for leaving. So I'll give you some examples, and again, I'll show you Matt's CV shortly. Again, this seems relevant to that earlier professional summary we looked at with the finance director. So let's imagine we've moved on a bit on his CV or her CV, and we're giving a little bit about the business and how this person fits into things. So the individuals describe their role, head of finance and IT, size of the business, both in terms of turnover and people, how the role operated, so quite a senior level, of course, a bit deeper knowledge, managed a certain number of people in certain disciplines, and oversaw certain functional responsibilities, and then the KPIs were blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. So this would be particularly relevant for the current role, and we'll come on to this in a little while, actually, in terms of how far back you need to go. But certainly current role and maybe one or two roles beforehand, depending on how much time you've been spent in them, you'd go into this level of detail. So it's not masses of information, but it's enough to set the scene. So this person's gunning for jobs in a turnover company which is, I don't know, $12 billion or something, 12 billion pounds. You might argue, is this person up to the task? Are they really capable of stepping up to that mark? That's all going to come out in the wash at some point in any event. if it's that important, people would have that as a selection criteria. So don't be afraid of putting things here that are fact, because all of those things will come out in the wash at some point in time. But they do help give people a reasonable understanding about what you're used to, what you're currently up to, and then they can relate that to their own expectations. Okay, we're going to show an example shortly of how that all hangs together. There's a little bit more to talk about career history and how you deal with your early career. Just very briefly, in terms of, I call it a popcorn break, but it doesn't actually give me a rest, which I've always found a bit strange, but it sort of stops the constant hurl of information about CV writing. Most people at the end of these sessions say, okay, I'm beginning now to wonder whether my CV is up to the job. And I hinted at the acid test is if you've had the pain of not getting interviews or not sufficient interviews for you to be happy, then that's telling you that your CV is not good. If you get to that point, the next thing is you need to decide is what do you do about it, and hopefully you'll say, well, I need to do something about it, and then do you do it yourself following guidelines such as tonight's, or do you seek professional help? And of course, if you go down that avenue, then we're one of the options. So if you are interested in that, then there's a process lurking behind it which is quite intensive but really useful and can help you sort your CV out and other means of getting more traction and interest in the marketplace. At the end of this session, Talentspa have said, okay, look, you can run these webinars, but you've got to offer our audience a good deal on your services, and so we do. Very briefly, we're obviously here to create CVs that boost your chances of getting interviews, and if you're interested in that kind of process, this is how it works. First of all, we match you up with somebody who understands your marketplace. They hold a telephone or Skype session with you, or however seems appropriate. That's typically an hour and a half to 2 hours long, during which we have a discussion with you that determines a number of things. It understands what on earth you're trying to do and gives you some guidance on whether that's realistic or not. So it's deeper than just writing a CV. It's really important, this. I've gone on about building a business case, understanding your target audience. That's really important stuff. Don't assume or take for granted any of that if you don't understand it. It's really key. It's so competitive out there right now. So we need to understand whether you're actually heading in the right direction and whether that's justifiable. Could we actually write a document to support you, or are you barking up the wrong tree? So that's the initial part of the discussion. We then work out what, if you don't already know it, and we check and balance it if you think you do. What's your value proposition? How are you getting to communicate that to the market? What are the skills you've got to offer the world? The career highlights that we talked about, or case studies if you like to refer to them as that. What are they? Are they strong enough? Will they work in the marketplace? And gradually we build the CV or business case from scratch. So we don't amend people's CVs, we don't tweak and refine them, we don't make them aesthetically slightly more pleasing. We start afresh and build a document that will get you interest and results. And as I say, at the end of this session, some really good deals if that's of interest to you. As I say, the stages are, do you need to take action? You'll know that from the stats you're getting or your own gut feel. First decision is, need to do something. Second decision is, seek professional help or do it myself, and then follow the path. Okay, back to the CV. I'll show you briefly, again, Matt's CV and how it looks, as you saw on page 1. I'm going to now show you, as it refreshes on your screen, we've got the bottom of page 1 of Matt's CV at the top of your screen, gradually. Just wait it for refreshing. And the top of page 2. And yeah, there it is, going through. Okay, so bottom of page 1, headed career history. Top of page 2, a continuation of that. So for Matt here, he's saying, yeah, of course, he's working for CVIA Group. He's the MD. He's done that from such and such a date to now. Very brief descriptor. So again, we're not talking very much here. Nobody outside of a few people will know who on earth we are in the first place. If we were going for jobs, it just describes briefly what we do. He's then describing his role, his team, some of his duties and responsibilities, and then describing some sort of key achievements and assignments that he's worked on that help demonstrate his ability to deliver. So there's some numbers in there, there's some figures, there's some reality, so it's a nice balance. Now this will differ for everybody. The weight and the size of the text that we use will differ for everybody because it depends on how many roles you've had and a whole range of other things. So all we're looking to do is give a nice, concise indicator to your target audience. This is what you're doing, this is what you're capable of, and here's some proof to back up delivery or ability. Okay, we then repeat that for, in Matt's case, another role where he was working at Hayes. So again, I'm just going to scroll down to, gradually the screen will update. You'll see shortly the bottom of page 2 of Matt's CV and the top of page 3. And so the role before his current role was with Hayes for about 6 years. Again, bit of a descriptor, slightly less text you'll notice now because it's less important. And then his earlier career, you'll notice, is just a couple of lines. Now notice 95 to 99 on page 3 of the CV, about a quarter of the way down. Earlier career, enterprise rent-a-car. One line, okay? The reason for that is not relevant to getting an interview that long back. However, to support his business case, he picked, remember that case, that career highlight, and about enterprise rent-a-car and turning around an underperforming business unit that they'd acquired. He's drawn that out of that time and mentioned it on page 1 of the CV because it's important. But the rest of what went on at enterprise rent-a-car is of no consequence to Matt getting an interview in the future. It's a great example of pick and choose what's relevant and what isn't. So for any of you out there who've got swathes of information about what happened in the 80s and 90s, unless there's some gems lurking in there that are really relevant, you don't need to devote space to those earlier roles. You really need to tone that back and focus on the stuff that will get you an interview. And for most people, that's what happened in the last few years. So earlier career, and we're almost done now, just so you know, we generally focus on the last 8 to 10 years in any detail, or 4 jobs, depending on your career, the gaps, the time spent. So that's a decision to be made on another day. But broadly, 8 to 10 years most recently in some detail, a bit like I just showed you on Matt's CV. The rest, just a line. So when you worked for them, who it was, what your title was. And I have to sometimes really go blue in the face trying to tell people that what they did more than 10 years ago is not materially going to get them an interview or not. It really isn't, with very few exceptions. So take an axe to that detail if you are going back too far. It really won't make a difference. You have to account for the time, but you can do that very much more briefly than most people do. Fine. Just to wrap up on a few other sections, because we're slightly overrunning, I'm going to, I do apologise, I've just zapped a few too many slides. Right, as regards education, you might have gathered now, we tend to shunt this towards the back of the CV. You don't need to talk about dates in terms of your qualifications. That's not important, and for some people may age them, which you don't want to be doing, particularly in the UK, unfortunately. But you do want to be talking about the highest level of education you've had and any professional qualifications, training or development that you've had. Personal details. So there's quite a few things to cover here, but I'll do them very briefly. So we, as you will have gathered, on Matt's CV, just his name, mobile number, I think either an email or a home number, I can't remember which way around it was. That's all we put at the front of the CV. Why? Number of reasons. Where you live, details of your marital status, date of birth, things like that, again, will not be getting you interviews. In fact, a lot of that we don't even put on the CV at all. But certainly address details, that can sometimes work for you, I suppose, but in a lot of cases it can work against you. If you're in Cornwall, you want to relocate to Glasgow, but you put on your CV that you're currently in Cornwall, unless you go into lots of complicated explanations about you wanting to relocate, recruiters will just look at it and think, hang on, guy in Cornwall, applying for a job in Glasgow, that's not going to happen, we're not paying relocation, end of. And you might have a covering letter somewhere explaining you want to relocate to Glasgow, but that's probably been binned a long time ago, or gone somewhere else, or been lost, or somebody's not absorbed that information. So our view is get your business case sorted first, then get your personal details mentioned far later than they normally are, towards the back of the CV. Yes, of course, if it's appropriate, talk about things like mobility in the sense of if you want to relocate, you can put that on the CV somewhere. You can put things like whether you've got security clearance, language skills, and eligibility to work in a particular marketplace. If you're looking to move, then those are all relevant things, but towards the back of the CV, not the front. A few general comments. You will have gathered that the writing style of the CV is quite important. Again, if that's not a strength of yours, my recommendation would be seek help. If you struggle in writing things, it will come across, it will look like that on your CV, it will not help your cause. Write the CV in the third person. You may have picked up on that if you saw Matt's example. There's no reference to Matt calling himself Matt or I. It's the third person, not the first person. Spelling's critical. So many CVs we see still contain spelling mistakes. In this current climate, and most recruiters will just use it as an easy reason to dismiss you. So if there's any mistakes on the document, however good you are, it's dead easy for a recruiter to justify why they rejected you because spelling mistake. They might even say spelling mistakes if there's only one. Employers are likely to back them up and say, oh yeah, okay, fair enough, fair cop, not interested. And formatting, again, crisp, concise, tight, neat and tidy, not stretching the text to the very end of the margins. That doesn't help your cause. Some people say, do I need 2 pages, 1 page, 3 page, 4 page? It doesn't matter, honestly. We've never had anybody come back to us, and unless they've been specifically asked to submit an application in a certain size, nobody's ever come back to us and said, you and so you gave me a 3-page CV, the market wants 2 pages, I want my money back. Never happened. It's a bit of an urban myth, unless somebody has specifically said up front that's what they want. What's important is the content on the CV. Typically, we write CVs that are 2 or 3, sometimes 4 pages long. We've never had a problem with that. Finally, in terms of the CV, a lot of people tend to put on the bottom of their CV, and some people even advise still to do this, references available on request. It's wholly meaningless. If people want references, they'll ask for them. Whether you've got them or not doesn't matter. It's part of the process, but it's part of the process way on down, way past interviewing. It's at a stage where you're going to get a job offer, or even if you've had a job offer. So talking about references on a CV is wholly pointless. However, what is useful is getting recommendations. So a bit like on LinkedIn, for those that are familiar with LinkedIn, if you've got any recommendations, and they can be put onto the CV, either from LinkedIn or other emails you've had, testimonial evidence you've been given, that can be really useful if it's from somebody that's either hired you, managed you, or had some kind of more senior involvement with you. If it's from somebody in your peer group, you have to be really careful about it, because that can look like a bit of a, old boys network, pat on the shoulder, nod and a wink, I'll recommend you, you recommend me, everything's happy. That shines through. People spot that a mile off. So use recommendations if you've got them. It's an optional extra. We put them on the CV. It adds value. That links to LinkedIn, which I'm not going to talk about now. We don't have time, and it's not part of the evening. But suffice to say, if you've got a bad CV and all you've done is dumped it onto LinkedIn, you're just replicating the problem. If you've got a good CV and you don't update your LinkedIn profile, that's not going to help you either. Remember earlier I said the vast majority of recruiters and hirers can only judge you on your CV's contents. Well, once they've done that, the vast majority of that 92% will go check you out on LinkedIn before inviting you to interview. So if you've got any inconsistencies or messages that aren't aligned with your CV on LinkedIn, you still run the risk of getting rejected when you've done all the hard work. Make sure that's sorted. Dealing with LinkedIn, actually, interestingly, is quite different from how you deal with a CV. Not structurally per se, but the way you phrase it, the way you structure it, the message you try and give, it's a wholly more complicated subject and for another time. Anybody interested in that, by all means approach us separately and we'll talk about it. But it's really important that you view that as being a key part of the job search. So if you're looking for work and you're not on LinkedIn, you probably ought to be. If you want to build your profile for some time in the future to work for you, you probably ought to be on LinkedIn. If you don't want to be on LinkedIn, I'd be really interested to know why. I understand sometimes people don't, but it's now at the point where so many people use it to find individuals. You ought to be super confident about your abilities in the marketplace if you don't want to be on LinkedIn. Okay, finally, I promised a special deal for those people that have decided. So if you thought, need help, don't want to do it myself, what are these guys are about, can they help? Well, we can help. Unfortunately, it costs money, less money than it might otherwise do. We offer service standard price, incidentally. Anybody with more than 7 years work experience, so if you've got less than 7 years of work experience, we need to have a separate conversation because it's not fair to charge you these prices. But if you've got more than 7 years work experience, you want to get your CV and LinkedIn profile sorted, ordinarily that would cost you 349 quid plus VAT. No, it's a lot of money, what the market rate generally is for a good service. Tonight, Talentspa said, okay, you've got to give us a good deal to pass on to our audience, so we do. You can save almost 100 quid by buying a service in the next few days if you're interested. So instead of 349 plus VAT, it's 275 plus VAT. There's a catch. That deal's only available until close of play Monday 20th, so that's next Monday. And you need to go, if you're interested, you give us a call in the office, or you use this link. And now you can't click on this via your screen, but if you bear with me, I'll just zap it into the chat room facility, and you can then copy it from there. That gives you a bit more details. It takes you to a landing page on our website, and if you want to make the payment and go through with it, it'll take care of itself and show you what to do. As an added incentive, we always say, hey, the first 10 orders we get, we give a little bit more as well. We are quite strict on this because this is, it's really adding a lot of package to the package. So first 10 orders get a free cover letter on top of the CV and LinkedIn profile, and access to an interview coaching package, which is an online thing, really useful. You can set up dummy interviews, practice, record your own performance, review it yourself. Really useful tool, free access to that as well. That's almost worth another 100 quid in its own right. Okay, all available through that link. If you're not quite there yet, want a bit more advice, want us to look at your CV, pop onto our website, give us a call, email us, more than happy to help. All of that bit's for free, give you advice, and steer you in the right direction. So that's it for this evening's sort of education bit. I know it's a bit of a zoom through things. We've gone over a little bit, for which I apologise, but hopefully you found that interesting and relevant. I promised I'd answer questions that have been asked, and there have been a few. So for those that need to disappear, you can, and good night to you, and good luck. For those that have asked questions or want to listen to the answers, I'll just whiz through what's been asked, and by all means, if you want to ask any more whilst we're online, by all means type away, and I'll go through, probably be able to address all of them by the looks of it. And then I'll let you know before I sign off and stop this thing and bring the webinar to a close. So, Ian, I think everybody's still online who asked a question. So Ian, I think, is the first one. Can you please explain the key differences, if any, between a CV for a permanent role and interim or contract roles? Very, very good question. Yes, and there are so many devils in the detail here, Ian, that it might be necessary of another conversation. But generally speaking, if you're an out-and-out contractor, have been for some time and continue to want to be so going forwards, there is a really good way of writing a CV that's far more case study based than it is chronologically order based. You can never ignore the chronological order. Everybody likes to know that you've been doing things consistently, or that there's some kind of structure to your career. So you can't escape from that. But if you're an out-and-out contractor, and you've got lots of experience doing that, there is a way of expanding the kind of career highlight side. So there's many more of those to demonstrate projects and contracts you've been working on, and then you escape that horrible trap of having to put on a CV what looks like lots of job hopping. Now, most people should understand what on earth a contractor is about, but unfortunately we know there's some people out there who just don't get it still. And so it gives a nice way of displaying the CV more as a look at all the proof I've got of being able to deliver in certain areas, and by the way, here's where I did it and the order in which I did it. So it changes the focus around. It's hard to describe on, in fact, actually, it's not so hard, because if Ian, you bear with me, I've got an example somewhere. Just bear with me, and I do apologise to everybody else because I'm now going to entertain Ian's personal question, but it may be useful for other people. If you just give me a couple of seconds, I will bring up a CV that's slightly different. Right, here we go. Okay, Ian, on the screen we have Matt's CV again, but written as if he were a contractor. You'll notice the top two bits are pretty much exactly the same, and that would be the intention. I mean, obviously you don't change the fundamental things, but from the key sort of the bullet point area downwards, it's a bit different. So you can see what he's saying is that actually Matt's current role, it's establishing a framework to say, look, he's a freelance contractor / interim manager with such and such a business, imagining that he was operating under that limited business or as an umbrella company or as a his own limited business. Brief description that he is a freelance contractor, and referring to the fact that he's completed a lot of projects and assignments within a particular arena, and here is a sample of them. And then you see at the bottom of page 1 a selection of assignments or projects or contracts that he's been involved with. Some of the things we add in here now these days, apart from the description of what he's been up to and the success, there's the length of the contract or project, but also we tend to add either here or elsewhere how many renewals or extensions he had, which is obviously a good positive indicator. If we look at page 2 of the CV, you can see many more cases. So on a permanent style CV, 3 career highlights. On a contract style CV, somewhere between 7 and 8 typically, in the form of projects or contracts, separate contracts. And then towards the bottom of page 2 of the CV, and you'll notice that there's career chronology, and that's the bit where it just says, okay, here, I've told you all about the wonderful things I've been up to and stuff I've been able to deliver. Just by the way, here's where I achieved it. So there's that sort of affirmation of some kind of consistency and structure to his career. And the rest of the CV is pretty much the same. Now, that suits certain people, Ian. It suits people who have got, as I say, a strong career background, contract career background, but it also only really works well where you're dealing either directly with employers or recruiters who understand the contract market. If they don't understand that, there's evidence to suggest you're better off with the more traditional CV. And so that's why there's a bit of devil in the detail. I hope that all makes sense, Ian. Bottom line is, for certain contractors, there's a different way of structuring the CV that helps them, works to their advantage, demonstrates their strengths. But in other certain circumstances, it's better to stay with what we'd call a more traditional permanent style CV, because some people just like it that way. And so it demands knowing your target audience a bit as well, and the recruiters in the middle of it. KV. Some recruiters do not like to deviate from standard format. They sometimes reject a modified CV. How do you get around it? That's a good question. In some, there's all sorts of things that go on, but at the bottom line, if you've got good content on your CV, it actually will help the recruiter. We know some recruiters, I don't know why they do it, but some recruiters amend CVs or copy and paste chunks of your own CV into a template. Sometimes because the recruiter wants to do it, sometimes because the employer demands it of the recruiter. Bottom line is, if we're not deviating from a standard format CV. There is no such thing as a standard format in a great scheme of things, KV. I don't mean to be deliberately argumentative about this. and who on earth decides what a standard format is? What most people don't like is lack of proof. And if there's one thing our CVs have got that's different from most, is proof, evidence to back up why you're capable of doing something. Now, most recruiters want to make a placement. They would normally spot a mile off somebody who's got some good evidence, and they'd want to use that in some fashion to promote your interests on their behalf so they get their placement fee, crudely. So in our experience, our CVs work well, however they get molested, because people pinch the good content, put it into whatever format they like, it tends to generate a better result. In fact, actually, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if recruiters are doing that, it does happen at the upper end of the spectrum quite often, actually. So for big search firms, they often like their employers like the recruiters to provide them with a standard template, but you'll notice that the recruiters desperately search for good quality evidence to prove the worth of the candidate. So I would argue that our format would work as well for you in any environment because it's got good content. The recruiter should probably spot that, use it, and get their placement. Okay, let's see, what else have we got? Teresa, so I just paused a bit because obviously I don't want to read out anything that's confidential or sensitive, so just bear with me, Teresa. Thanks for saying, I appreciate your comments, thank you. Left my job, okay, what should I say about my CV? Most jobs require recently, now looking for a job, haven't had any interviews so far. Right, Teresa, yeah, it's a really good question. So Teresa's got a gap in her career, and how do you explain it on the CV? Well, the reality is you can't change what's happened, of course, and you need to account for time, and there's no point in trying to imagine there's a way around that. However, using the structure I've explained this evening allows you to build that business case before you get to the point at which you're having to talk about your most recent experience, however long ago that is. Now, I recently worked with an individual who'd, for different reasons, been out of work for just over a year now, so had a gap. The trouble was their CV accentuated that gap, because almost the first thing they said was, the last employment I had was this job. There's obviously a big gap between today's date and that last job. Didn't explain it very well, so it brought it to the fore. You'll have noticed on our CVs, or our CV style, and the style that I would recommend to you, is that we're not talking about your most recent experience until much later. We're trying to build a business case. Now, realistically, you'll have to accept, I guess, if people are hell-bent on you having literally just come out of a role, you can't offer that, and so you'll not win all the battles. But you'll win more of the battles than you're currently getting if you can prove to the audience that you're targeting that you have relevant experience or competencies that would work well, and that you can bring them to the marketplace. That will work a lot better. I hope that helps. You also asked about security clearance. So yes, for certain people, just the reference to the fact that you have security clearance is sufficient. So literally one line saying SC security clearance or whatever level you have. And if it's really appropriate to your target audience, Teresa, then maybe one of the career highlights or some mention of your ability to work in a sensitive environment would be worth drawing out. And actually, linked to your earlier question, that might be a really useful way of helping to prove to people that you've got the skill set and credentials to do a job, and you build that message before they get to the bit about what your most recent job was. And genuinely, some people may, if they feel good about you, they'll pick up the phone, send an email, or put you in the maybe pile before they read the rest of the CV. So that sort of 30-second rule I was going on about can sometimes work well for people with gaps in their career, because sometimes they're put in the yes pile or the maybe pile before anybody's realised that they're actually not been working for 12 months or so. Again, we'll never know the reality to that, and I can't tell you statistically that will always be the case, but it does happen. Danny, is there a specific font to be used and size of font? Not necessarily, Danny, but there are some good and bad points. We use typically, I think, Arial 10 point. The main reason it's just crisp clear, doesn't offend anybody's databases, it will always scan well, and it's a nice balance between size of text on the page and size of allowing enough characters, of course, to fit onto a piece of paper and being able to be read accurately. Times New Romans, it's all very subjective, to be honest, because I'm sure there's some people who might hate Arial, but bottom line is we know that works. Nobody's ever come back and said, oh, you so-and-so's, you give me a CV in Arial and everybody hates it. Tends not to happen. Extremes always cause problems, so Comic Sans Serif is a horrible one because it looks just too childish. And I apologise if I've just offended anybody whose CV is emblazoned with Comic Sans Serif, but it's not a good font. Likewise, any of those ridiculously enhanced handwriting-like look ones that you can get, just all no-nos. I pick generally any clear one that's commonplace. So that includes Garamond, the one beginning with C, or what is it, Kariba, something, Times New Roman, Arial, Zadana. They're all fairly straightforward, innocent ones. Wouldn't go much above a size 12 font, Danny, otherwise it just looks a bit odd and you struggle to get text on the page. But they vary, on, as you probably know, according to the font itself in terms of how they look. Hope that helps. Claudia, do you think it's good to put in LinkedIn you're looking for a new... Oh, really good question, Claudia. Thank you for that. Yes. Do you think it's a good idea to put that you're looking for a job on LinkedIn? Our general rule of thumb is no, it isn't good. And the reason why is, and this goes back to what I said earlier about LinkedIn, although we didn't go into detail. LinkedIn's in an ideal world, your LinkedIn profile should be something that attracts people. They look at it, however they find you, they look at it and they think, I really hope this person's available and interested in what I've got to tell them. So it should be a hook. It's almost like a website. So when you go to a website for a house, car, washing machine, TV, camera, yes, of course, the message is slightly different there. They're saying, here's a great deal, but they're not screaming, buy me, buy me, buy me. They're doing it a little bit more subtly, although it's not perhaps the best comparison. As an individual, you certainly don't want to be saying to the world, here am I don't suggest, Claudia, you're in this camp, but you don't want to appear desperate. You don't want to give the impression that actually everything rests on somebody giving you a call, however desperate you may actually be. What you need to create is an impression that you've got the skills and the competencies that your audience are looking for, and that there are a means of getting hold of you because you've either put an email or you're open to being connected with and contacted via email or whatever. But you don't really want to be saying that you're actively looking, because that puts the power in the other person's camp, and you want to control that slightly. You want to appear to be the right person, but they need to do a little bit of work to see if you're available and interested. That's the ideal. Julian, what is the risk of a recruiter spotting a professionally written CV and rejecting it because of that? Well, I'd say genuinely, Julian, no risk at all. Again, hand on heart, we have never had anybody come back to us saying this was rejected because, in the main, in fact, we'd have very rarely people spotted it, interestingly. We think it's quite obvious. We know there's a difference between the documents, but I suppose it's not reached saturation point or anywhere near saturation point, unfortunately. So I'd say no risk at all. In fact, for the few people that have ever got into a discussion about it, it normally goes something like this, and it's normally at the upper end of the market rather than the junior end of the market. So I don't know where you are on that scale, but the conversation sometimes has gone, we know, yeah, we selected you because of your CV, obviously because it was good. Individual might then either cross their fingers and think, well, that's great, the money I spent was good, but I'm not going to tell you it was written by somebody else, so end of, and we hear the positive feedback. Or the individual, the candidate, says, well, that's really nice to hear, actually, I got it professionally written. Nobody's ever said, oh, so it's not yours, it's fake. It's not like that. It's more good investment, right decision, good call, oh, you can see the difference. It genuinely is that kind of comment. Most people appreciate it because it's either made their job easier, they're going to get a placement out of you as an individual, it's added value, and it's been the right thing to do. It's a bit like seeking professional help. I think nobody's going to moan at you because you got your plumber in to fix your taps, or a tree surgeon to chop your tree down. Nobody's going to accuse you of doing anything other than the right thing. It's just same approach. Faye, I hope I've pronounced your name right. If I had a break in my career out of recession, should I show the gap in my CV? Yes, generally, yes. If you try and hide things, it just becomes obvious, and people will question you at some later stage if you do get an interview, and it can all get a bit messy. Our general rule of thumb is honesty is the best policy. As I say, the way you structure the CV can work to your advantage by building the business case before you talk about the chronological order of things, but you should mention what you've been up to and whether there have been any breaks. If you've done anything in that time to add value to yourself, to train, to develop, to learn things, or just to take time out, so many people that's happened to, it's not an unusual thing any longer. 25 years, 30 years ago, maybe it's a different story, but I wouldn't worry about it right now. I'd just be honest. Language skills, yeah, really important, Anders. If you've got language skills, shout them from the rooftop, well, metaphorically speaking, because relatively few people have them. It's a great differentiator, and if it's a real thing you're putting a lot of importance on, maybe build a career highlight or something around that in your CV. Jitesh, if I have a very good CV specifically targeted toward my audience, can I simply rely on recruiters finding me, assuming it's on the right job sites, or do I still need to sift through numerous email hits each day and apply with a specific cover letter? Mixture, Jitesh, to be honest. Combination of CV and LinkedIn will get you, if it's on the right places, it will get you found and people will talk with you. Most people get fed up with the number of approaches they have because the approaches are maybe not the best approaches. So that I hope you're not selling double glazing in Glasgow, but if you are, apologise. But a lot of people will get a call convincing them, of course, that that's the best thing they need to be doing with their lives because they spotted their CV. So you get the rough with the smooth. But broadly, yes, good CV, good LinkedIn profile, you'll get more attention. It sort of goes hand in hand. But I'm afraid it doesn't take away the fact that you're still going to have to search for stuff as well, because not everybody's using the same tools, it's just one of those things. You've got to do a bit of work as well, but a good marketing documents on your behalf will help. Say, recent times, last 2 years, I had more short-term contract work on my CV. How can I avoid this looking like massive job hopping? Good question. Now, that's a real devil detail thing. Say, we need to probably look at that in a bit more detail. There are ways and means of packaging that. So it might be that actually you take the whole period of that time, so that last 2 years, instead of trying to explain every single one in detail, or not in detail, but separately, bundle it up into one chunk of time and just said that you've done a variety of short-term contracts, including, and then give a few examples. So that would be my recommendation. You could probably compartmentalize all of that 2 years into one chunk of time with a variety of activities without it looking like lots and lots and lots of jobs, would be my advice. Thanks Ian. Appreciate that. Adeyemi, hi MC, how do I write a career change CV? Well, again, it all depends, Adeyemi, on what career you're trying to do. If you've got the skill set or transferable skill set and you're looking to shift, if it's a dramatic shift, then that takes a lot of thought and effort. You've got to draw out all of the things that you have got in your toolkit to appeal to your target audience, and just accept that you're going to be up against people who are already in that space doing that job, so it's going to be harder than normal. But there's always an exception to the rule, always people looking for fresh talent, people with outside experience, outside the sector experience. So if you can put together a strong business case to say, okay, you know, recognize I've not got the actual experience, but I've got the transferable skills, somebody somewhere will probably say, okay, maybe give this person a bit of a break. But it is tough. But it's all about trying to assess what is the target. It's always down to what's the target audience looking for, what have I got to match against that target audience, and then making the most of what you've got. So that's how you do it, bottom line. Dead easy to say, much harder to do, I'm afraid. David, I appreciate your feedback. Thank you for that. Good to go online for a link for our auditors. Wow. Well, David, hats off to you. You're my favourite attendee. He's gone off to order our CV package. Brown envelope on its way. Natalie, good idea to you. Oh, right. Hi, Natalie. Natalie, a good idea to use a photo? No, it's a good idea not to use a photo. In the UK, that assumes. In the parts of Asia, Pakistan, India, a lot of people use the photos there. That's a cultural thing. In the UK, Western Europe, Australasia, US, Eastern Europe, in fact, most places I can think of don't use a photo unless you're specifically asked for it. How do I state a break due to travel? How much detail shall I put? Again, depends a little bit on what you're trying to do, Natalie. If you're if the travel's got anything to do with what you're trying to do career-wise, could talk about it and big it up, so to speak. If it's got nothing at all to do with what you're trying to do, then yeah, just mention it. Plenty of people go off and travel, and if you can extrapolate anything that you've gathered and gained from that experience, then perhaps there's something to be made of it. So again, it depends on whether it helps your cause. So always think, what's the target audience looking for? If you don't think they're going to be remotely interested in your travel, don't put too much detail. If you think it might add some value, put it in. It's the sort of thing, again, we'd go through in a lot more detail, of course. So I hope that gives you a bit of a clue. So it's all relevant to what you think the target audience are looking for. So again, crude example, if you wanted to be a checkout operator at your local Tesco's, actually, in that case, they might be interested because it's a bit of a differentiator, and they might like the fact that you've experienced different things. But broadly, they're probably going to think, well, you know, big deal, so it's not really that useful. However, if you're going to go off and work down a travel operator or a business that required a cultural understanding of some other part of the world, could be really useful. Jitesh, what percentage of contractors are capitalising on a professionally written CV, reaping the benefits? At what point do you think professionally written CV will become the de facto, hence less competitive edge? How news? That's a really good question, Jitesh. I wish we were at the point, I really do wish we were at the point where it was becoming a law of diminishing returns, because yeah, we'd have earned a lot more money now, and I'd probably be off on my yacht rather than doing a webinar. And and so, but it is a very valid question. Very hard to give a precise number, to be honest. I'd say we're still way off getting anywhere near the stage where you need to even worry about it. It's still a big differentiator. And I have to say, the other thing lurking behind this is if you Google, you know, CV writing companies, you'll get buried in, like many other things, you get buried in potential people. But there are people out there who claim to be able to do what we're saying we're going to do for, I don't know, 30, 40, 50, 60, 90 quid. And it just doesn't stack up. Yeah, in the UK, if you want something like this doing, it's pretty much the kind of money that I've shown you this evening. Anybody charging less is either spending less time on it or less quality of people. Hand on heart, it's just it's just like everything else. It isn't quite. There are some people charging a lot more than us, and I do wonder why that is. Honestly, I do wonder. We've seen the results from all sorts of people. Quite a lot of the business we get is from people who've already spent, I don't know, anywhere between 75 and 150 quid on their CV to have it so-called professionally written, and I'd not have gathered that in a million years. I look at it and I think, I'm really surprised, and I have to find a nice way of saying, you know, you've not spent your money wisely. But, you know, it's just the way the world is, I'm afraid. So I think bottom line is nowhere near a point where you need to worry about it. Therefore, it's still a competitive advantage, and I think it will continue to be a competitive advantage as far as I can see, because there are all sorts of providers out there, and they're not all good. So I hope that answers. And is it okay to, somebody asked a question, I can't see who this was, is it okay to use brackets to include additional info on CV? Not really sure what that refers to, but so if anybody's still on who asked the question about using brackets on CV, if they could expand, I'll hang on for another few seconds. Meantime, that's all the questions answered now. Quite a lot of you stayed on to listen to that, so I really do appreciate it. I hope you found that useful. And what will happen is that, Jitesh, I'll come back to you very shortly. What will happen is that you'll all get invited to have a viewing of this recording. Again, if you want, if you want to subject yourself to this again, you'll get a link to it tomorrow morning, and a reminder at some stage that that Monday deadline exists for the offer deal. But as I say, if you've got any questions or want to talk to us individually, just give us a call, drop us an email, and we'll do our best to help. Okay, Jitesh, blah, 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 offering me to do this, I'm going to get a classic case of... my suspicion, Jitesh, unless they're doing it as a favour, yes, I'd say it is what you're going to get what you pay for. It's really hard because I don't want to slag anybody else off in the marketplace because I just don't know who they are and what their situation is. We are a proper business, therefore, like most proper businesses, we are going to carry a level of overhead more than somebody set up in their garage who's not VAT registered, who's not maybe even incorporated, and can just do a few favours to a few people. So, you know, if there are any really good writers out there operating like that, then in fairness, they could probably do what we're doing cheaper. Yeah, that could technically be a justifiable reason. But then, you know, some people just like to deal with proper established businesses. So we've got the infrastructure, we've got all the things that we do. Yes, that involves an element of overhead, and so therefore we have to charge a price that can recover those overheads like any other business. So, you know, I know there are people out there cheaper, but the reality is a good CV writer in the UK costs somewhere between 25 to 45 quid an hour to run. Most of them are freelancers and contractors, and then Matt engages their services, trains them, and gets them to write a CV in the way that I've explained this evening. We've got a small team who do that, and they need remunerating, of course, and they put a lot of effort in. So if we're going to spend a couple of hours on the phone with you, or anybody else for that matter, 5 to 6 hours writing the CV, 1 or 2 hours maybe doing the LinkedIn profile, and maybe a few minutes here and there adminning and going to and fro and amending the CV, you can do the maths. You're looking at 9 to 12 hours of time to get a result. However way you cut it, that's a chunk of money and therefore investment in time. If you can do that for 50 quid, then surely something's got to give, unless they're doing a favour for you. So okay, I won't mention. Thank you, Jess. I won't mention the company just in case, because that's probably not professional on my part. But I might do a bit of digging. I have heard of them, and I've seen some of the results. Again, what level of service some of the customers were paying for, I don't know, in all honesty. But yeah, I think there's a difference there. I think you'd notice a massive difference. You'd expect to notice a massive difference, of course, with their level of pricing. But I think if you were remotely interested, by all means, if you want to come back and talk separately, maybe that's the best way to handle it, and I would deal with the situation then. And to all the others listening, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a sort of a relatively sensitive discussion about some other company offering to do something for an amount of money, less than our amount of money, and I don't, obviously I need to be careful what I say. But the reality is, like any service these days, you'll find people at one end of the spectrum, people at other end of the spectrum, lots of people in the middle, and I'm afraid nobody knows until it's too late whether they've made the right decision on these things. I can only tell you that people like Talentspa and a few other professional organisations use us to do these sort of things. We wouldn't be around if we produced rubbish, because yeah, that would get fed back. Okay. Yeah, okay, just bear with me, Jitesh. I'll answer that question privately right now. And I think, Prafula, I'm multitasking now, Prafula, so just bear with me. I'm trying to do something clever whilst answering your question, and it's not working very well, so just bear with me. Okay, that's that bit. Right, Prafula, thank you for the webinar. Really interesting, quite interested. Hope to be in touch. So I'm not very senior, but I am professional. Okay, that's a good sort of. I appreciate the comment, and if you're still there, and to anybody else, genuinely don't worry about the level that you're at. The key thing is the amount of experience you've got. Certainly, if you equate, as I said earlier, if you've just graduated, got anything less than sort of 3 or 4 years experience, then certainly you don't need to be paying 275 plus VAT. That's not fair. So if you're equating seniority with cost, don't worry about that. But anybody at any level, we literally, I've joked slightly tongue-in-cheek about the Tesco supermarket operator a few times this evening. We've written CVs at this level for exactly that kind of person who want to escape from that, do something different. So the methodology applies at any level whatsoever, genuinely. We write a lot of CVs for pure graduates with no work experience, recent graduates with some experience, and people right at the other end of the spectrum. It really doesn't matter. The methodology is exactly the same. What's the target audience looking for? What have you got in your toolkit to meet their needs? Match the two in a document as best you can. I say it's as simple as that, but it is as simple as that. And I think that's it. So thank you very much again to everybody. I'll now shut this down, and I wish you a good night. And I shall. Sorry, just a few more people typing stuff in, but it's just saying thanks and good night. So yeah, okay, I appreciate that, Jitesh. Yeah, so good night to everybody, and best of luck to you all. And if you need our help, you know where we are. Okay, thank you again. Cheers.